would be, a brief introduction would be really inadequate. But yeah, so Vigita is a feminist activist, writer, translator, and historian based in Chennai. She's also a publisher and co-director of Tara Books and the independent publishing house, world renowned for its illustrated children books from a diversity of themes. She writes in English and Tamil on issues related to caste, feminism, and Tamil society and history. She has been active in the women's movement in India and political struggles in Tamil Nadu for many years. Some of her path-breaking works include Patriarchy and Stree. She is involved in Tamil theatre as a scriptwriter and has also translated two of Perumal Murugan's novels into English. She has been researching the work and thoughts of Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, and we are very happy, truly happy to have her and to learn from her during this workshop. I would like to thank her on the behalf of our Department of Humanities and Social Sciences of Indian Institute of Technology, Bombay, for organizing this much required for organizing a program on a much required theme. I would like now request Dr. Vigita to continue with her session.
Thank you very much, Rupali. And thanks, Kushal and the Humanities and Social Sciences program at IIT Bombay. I'm actually quite excited to be doing this. For me, it's a labor of love. I was very fond of Gail, both as a person and as a scholar. So, and I've been reading her for nearly 2.5 decades now. So, it's a pleasure to share whatever insights I might have gleaned during these years of reading with all of you here. I just want to start with a very brief introduction to what Gail has meant to scholars who um, have been engaged with studying the anti caste movements and traditions of India. Gail's book on Mahatma Phule and the Satyashodak Samaj was published in 1971. Her essays were first featured in the Economic and Political Weekly, and some of those essays went on to become chapters in the book Cultural Revolt in a Colonial Society. So she was one of the very early scholars to be studying anti caste movements. And prior to that, you had Eleanor Zelliot, who had looked at Baba Sahib Ambedkar's movement, but her book came out much later. And Gail was, of course, as Kushal pointed out, was a very prolific researcher and writer, and she kept up a continuous stream of writing in going from the early 70s till almost the late 90s, after which her writing became little more sporadic. But for those of us who were trying to understand anti caste movements and histories, her work was truly a kind of a prototype, a model. And Rosalind O'Hanlon's work on the Satyashodak Samaj and Jyotirao Phule was published much later. And today, of course, you have very exciting scholarship on the anti caste movements, not just in the traditional bastions of anti caste politics, which is Maharashtra and Tamil Nadu, but also writings that engage with movements in northern India, in the Punjab, in the former United Provinces, in Andhra, in Telangana, in Kerala, in Karnataka. So much of this scholarship has been produced over the last 15 to 20 years. But when I and my colleague Rajadurai started working on the Tamil non-Brahmin movement and the anti-caste politics of Periyar and the Self-Respect League, we really didn't know how might one even conceptualize this in the context of modern Indian history, because as many of you know, anyone who studied even school, high school level history knows, Indian history in the modern period, which usually starts from say 1857 to 1947, is narrated as a story of Indian nationalism and other characters on the stage, whether it's the communists, whether it's the social reformers, whether it's peasants or Adivasis, feature as secondary characters in this narrative, if at all they feature. And so, growing up with such a history, we really don't have a sense of the significance of anti caste movements as they unfolded in the modern period. And I think Gail's work provided us both with a very carefully written empirical account of what had transpired in the Bombay province, starting with the Satyashodak Samaj, but also of Jyotirao Phule's early work in education, his writings, which belong to the time that he was engaged with the peasant question, leading up to his writings on the Satyashodak Samaj. And Gail also provided us with a conceptual apparatus to think about the anti caste movements, because otherwise they were seen either as radical forms of social reform, which looked to the colonial state to legislate bad practices out of existence, and therefore what was termed by some historians at least as pro colonial, as loyalist to the colonial government, or they were seen as matters, as movements that dealt with important concerns, but which really could not be addressed unless we had become politically free of colonial rule, or if we were socialists or communists, it was held that unless the economic basis of the social order was addressed and transformed, it does not really uh, uh, it's not really consequential to be looking at matters to do with caste. So caste was relegated to the superstructure, so to speak, and a lot of political attention was focused on the base, as Marxists defined the social totality, as they called it. So Gale gave us a way of thinking beyond the nationalist and the standard communist frameworks. And so, for those of us writing about anti caste movements, her work was both inspirational as well as it set the terms of debate, which some of us accepted, some of us did not, but which were absolutely necessary if we wish to conceptualize anti caste politics and movements. So, that was my first engagement with Gail, and I think I started reading her in earnest in the 1990s and have followed her work since then and have learned a lot from her, not just the content of what she has to offer us, but also the tone of her writing: scholarly, elegant, non acrimonious, very principled in her refusal to go with arguments she did not consider valid, and equally principled in accepting arguments partially and rejecting others as not quite relevant to her purpose. So she also, for some of us, set the tone for civilized scholarship, for what might be called civil exchange in the realm of ideas. And I think that is also something very valuable in these days of hate speech and complete intolerance. So Gail, for me, therefore, has been a very important thinker in more ways than one. Now, more recently, over the last few years, I have returned to some of her writings on feminism, especially her early work and the work that she did on women's movements in the 1990s, for two reasons. One, um, many of us have been very concerned about what we might call the future of Indian women's movements. Where are we today? What are the concerns that we need to be addressing? Where has our history of organizing or mobilizing around particular issues brought us? Are there issues that we have not addressed or addressed partially? What are the limits to our politics? What sorts of insights have we had that we need to develop further? So there has been a questioning within groups, and also these questions have emerged in the conversations that feminists have had with each other. So this is on the one hand. On the other hand, we've also had a younger generation of activists and scholars, feminists, those that identify themselves with queer politics, asking us questions about our own feminisms. And these questions have emerged from a number of locations, but more particularly from an emergent generation of women from Bahujan and Dalit communities, from Adivasi contexts, from amongst Muslim communities in India, and from queer feminists. So I think there's been a lot of ground that needs to be therefore re-examined. And in the course of that re-examination, I went back to those who were active and writing in the 70s and 80s, and Gail clearly was one of them. And that classic book of hers, We Shall Smash This Prison, was something that I read over lockdown after many years. And I realized that it spoke to me in some very important ways. And I was particularly struck by this one fragment, that a fragment of a paragraph in very early on in the book, where she talks of how she's been interviewing people in Maharashtra and in Marathwada, in fact, and many of the people that she spoke to were peasants, peasant women, or Mahar Dalit agricultural women laborers, and the conversation seems to have veered around to many issues. But while talking of debt bondage, when Dalits found themselves having to do veti or begar on the farms of landlords, and or in the fields of rich peasants, and also how, in order to service their debt, it was not uncommon for women to also find themselves in sex work in Bombay City or elsewhere. And one of the women that Gail spoke to told her, and I quote, Gail had asked her, how does she see the situation change and how would things get differently? How would things improve in the future for Dalit agricultural laborers? And this woman said, and I quote, this is on page 11 of the book: buy freedom for our men, give them land, only land. It is these green fields that will contain our girls. And I was actually profoundly moved and struck by this statement, because what we are hearing is a very measured and reasoned out response to a condition of both economic exploitation and social oppression. The fact that many agricultural laborers are without land, and most of them are Dalits, though not exclusively so, that women especially have only their labor and their sex identity to transact when it comes to securing a livelihood, and that the larger agrarian economy with its inequalities has to be transformed for women's lives to be transformed. Now, this did not mean that one had to wait for a peasant revolution before women's lives could change, because women themselves were very aware of what needed to be done, which meant then that they saw themselves as part of this movement for change. But they were very clear in their articulation of what was really the problem, in terms of which they could assess and evaluate their own lives. And I think for Gail, this experience of being with peasant and agricultural women workers led her to think of the land, labor, and gender questions as interrelated. The land, labor, and gender questions as interrelated. This is on the one hand. And on the other hand, to think of land, caste, and class together. So basically, she tried to conceptualize what Marxism would call relationships of production, both within the terms of the caste order and within the terms of the kinship caste structure. So she was looking at both property and the absence of property, as well as the role played by family, kinship, and caste in sustaining this contradiction between those that had access to land and property and those that had only their labor power to fall back upon. And caste, with its roots in the familial and kinship structures, seemed a very crucial aspect of both production as well as social reproduction. And I think Gail owed a lot of her understanding in this regard to what she had heard and experienced on the field, both in the course of her research and later on in being part of many social and economic struggles in the area of Maharashtra, where she lived for much of her life. And she kept up with these themes and she worked with them over the decades. And she was very careful to look back and ask herself and other scholars, were we right in saying the things we did? What are the things we ought to rethink? What are the things we ought to take on board, because times are changing? And how do we therefore keep returning to our concerns but in renewed critical ways? So in the 1970s, she had a certain understanding of the relationship between family, kinship, caste, labor, land. But in the 1980s, she reworked the terms of that relationship. And in the essays that I have put in your reading folder, you'll notice that the 1975 essay that was published in the Bulletin of Concerned Asian Scholars is a very passionate and feminist perspective. It offers us a passionate feminist perspective on um, the inequalities in agrarian Maharashtra, from where it sort of extrapolates a larger argument. Her 1986 essay, where she compares the emergence of the women's question in India and Thailand, you will see her looking back on the 70s and saying, perhaps we did not speak enough of family and kinship in those days. We thought that once you address the question of property and land and production, you actually had a way of engaging with the issues that bothered women. But clearly, now it's evident that women are concerned not only about the work that they do outside and all that follows in its wake, but equally about their place in the household, in the family, in the kinship structure, the caste order. So you find Gail actually within this scope of, say, 11 years, moving from one position into another and keeping up a conversation over the years with her own work and the work of other scholars. So, this is something also that you realize about Gail's understanding of feminism or women's concerns or the women's question, that it was never static. It changed and moved in keeping with the changes that were happening around her, but this did not mean that she was sort of endlessly relative in her reasoning. Far from it. She wasn't relative at all. And this you realize when you look at how she understood the changes that had taken place in India over the long period of modernity, if you want to call it that, from the beginnings of the colonial period well into her own time. And then you see how she sees the role of capital as equally important as the role of agricultural land relationships. So, the agrarian economy then becomes something that you have to understand not only in terms of who has land, who doesn't, who labors, which caste has access, but also in terms of what has capital done to land relationships. And her engagement with capital is fascinating because often we tend to see capital, even today, as a sort of uh, social location. You know, a capitalist is someone who commands capital, and it becomes a badge of social identity rather than as a dynamic economic form. And for Gail, as it was for Karl Marx, capitalism was a very dynamic economic system, and she was very interested in unpacking the various elements of this dynamic system. What has it brought into the existing economic context? What does it wish to transform? What does it wish to destroy? What transformative potential, if any, does capital have? In other words, as Marx asked in the Communist Manifesto, can capital sort of completely recast the terms of existence and thereby foreground those very sharp contradictions that would make for a revolutionary struggle? So these were concerns that Gail also kept in mind. And so, therefore, when she spoke of women and their concerns, she located those concerns both within the agrarian context and within a modern economic context where capital held sway. Now, we will, of course, look at that in some detail in the second workshop. But for now, I just want to sort of leave you there with the terms of her understanding of what we might call the social totality, that it included both agrarian relations of production and the changes brought in by capital and capitalism. At the same time, she never lost sight of the fact that what women endured at home in relationships, especially in intimate relationships, whether with their natal families or with their marital families, cannot only be understood in terms of their location within an economic system. And here, of course, she owed a great deal to the feminist debates of her time, both in India as well as across the world. And I will come to that in a minute. But basically, she was very aware of what we might call the relative autonomy of the women's question, that it cannot be reduced to an understanding of what was transpiring in the realm of the agrarian economy or in an economy where capital held sway or where both were connected. This was important for her because there was a tendency in standard communist arguments of the 1970s, or in a more general sense in progressive circles, to think of the women's question largely in terms of the broader class struggle that was to be waged. And Gail, from the very beginning, was very uneasy with that formulation. While she was not averse to the class struggle or to centering the class struggle, she wished to foreground the fact of women's subordination and oppression as also emerging from other sources. And while you don't have much of a description of these other sources in her 1975 essay, she nevertheless points to this fact. And then in the 1986 essay, you see her having developed this in a sort of completely detailed fashion. And the other essay I've put in your abstract, the essay on patriarchy, which she wrote around the same time, you find her offering a theoretical model, drawing from current debates as to how you can think of women's subordination. So for Gail, therefore, this whole question of women's lives and what women endured, what women fought with, what women were doing, had to be seen in the context of the social totality, but the social totality itself had to be rethought in terms of women's life experiences and all the things that contributed to those life experiences. So this was something very, very important. And as you will read in that essay on patriarchy, she makes some very, very sharp observations where she points out that patriarchy is not equal to gender subordination. It's a very intriguing kind of formulation by which she means there are gender differences. And then you have, and many of you who are students of sociology know this, you have the gender roles theory, which are mapped onto gender differences: masculinity, femininity, male roles, female roles. Gail, of course, refuses to accept that there are any such given female roles or male roles. She's too much of a historically minded person to accept that. But she also goes on to say that you may have gender differences. You might even have gender roles that are rigidly defined. You may have male entitlements that are not shared with women, but these do not necessarily make for patriarchy. So, in her understanding, patriarchy has to be understood as a system that emerged in history at the same time as society became divided into very distinctive classes and the state became an important political factor. And of course, in the Indian context, in her later work, she would trace this to both the Buddhist state under Ashoka, where she would speak of class differences having emerged, and to the Brahmanical reaction and the Gupta period and later periods, later Indian history, where she would speak of how the state becomes resolutely patriarchal and committed to the tenets of the Manusmriti. So for her, patriarchy was a historically evolved condition which cannot be thought of separately from the emergence of class and state. And in the Indian context, this would necessarily require us to engage with what she and many others in the anti-caste tradition term as the Brahmanical reaction to Buddhism, or the Brahmanical reactionary politics that emerged in early medieval India. Anyway, I'm not going to go into a history of all of that, but what I want us to take on board here is for Gail to understand patriarchy in India, it was important to understand the conditions of its historical emergence. And here she assigned a very important role to what she termed anti caste movements, their histories, and their literatures. Even in that essay that you have on patriarchy, you will find in the first paragraph Gail pointing to how Indian feminists are taking inspiration from Buddhist literature, from the Lokaita tradition, and so on. So she saw anti-caste literatures, anti-caste thought, anti-caste practices as a very valuable resource for the struggle against patriarchy, which in turn meant a struggle against caste and the tyrannical state. So this is how you see Gail's life world emerging even in the very first decade of her scholarship. And one need not be particularly surprised by this, given the way she taught, but also because of her very early acquaintance with the Maharashtrian non-Brahmin and anti-caste movements, particularly the life and work of Mahatma Phule and the Satyashodak Samaj. And I have assigned that article for the third workshop. But if you were to read her early work, Cultural Revolt in a Colonial Society, you will see the sort of importance she assigns Mahatma Phule's thought world, so to speak. So the anti-caste traditions become for her a very important conceptual uh, archive and memory for fighting patriarchy and for anyone invested in the feminist question in India. So this is by way of a general description of where Gail starts her theorizing from what she actually observed, and how she then sought to kind of connect it to other things in the first decade of her work in India and so on, and how she also stayed with these concepts, reflecting on them, renewing them critically, re engaging with them for the rest of her life. So, this is the first part of my presentation today. And the second part, I want to engage with what were the influences that fed into Gail's conceptual world, what shaped it in some ways. And, and while doing that, I want us also to think of um, how does one understand influence itself, so to speak, not only in terms of what intellectual or political tradition one locates oneself in, but also what one makes of that tradition. How does one inherit it in some ways and transform it in other ways? And I think to understand Gail's work, both are very important. Where she locates herself, how does that location then become not an inheritance in the kind of a, let's say private property sense, but as something that you creatively work with, transform, and pass along. So I think that's also very, very important. And when we speak of influences, we are looking at two sets of things. One is the actual movements and struggles that Gail was witness to, of which she was a part, some of which she was a part, and the kinds of things she was reading and thinking about, and the kinds of debates and dialogue that she was engaged in, right from the early 1970s. So we're looking then at both what she learned from the ground, so to speak, and from scholarship and her own research. So I'm going to talk of the scholarship and research first, and I will get down to what she learned on the ground later. But I do hope that some of you have had the chance to watch Deepa Dhanraj's films that I had put up for viewing, particularly the black and white films, three of them, because they more or less capture the kind of women's struggles, the spaces of struggle that Gail references in her early work. In fact, they capture the essence of the questions around gender, caste, and class that Gail was very actively invested in. So, those films actually allow us to enter the worlds that Gail was writing about. So, one of the readings in your workshop one is an extract is an essay that she wrote in a sort of fringe feminist magazine in the United States called Big Mama, which is a lesbian magazine. A lesbian collective ran that magazine, but it was also very invested in radical politics across the world. So you have news stories from El Salvador, from various other parts of the world. And Gail writes on what she was witness to in Nipani, where the women uh, tobacco workers were on struggle, and also records the fact that many of them are from the Devadasi community. And this exactly is the world that Deepa Dhanraj captures in her film on the struggle in Nipani. Gail also talks of how there were these eager urban women trade unionists, and Deepa's film on domestic workers and their organization in Pune, where Gail was living and working at this time, she was familiar with that union as well. And you see the emergence of that union. And Gail was also very cognizant of developments in other parts of India. And this, I must say, sets her apart from so many scholars who tend to extrapolate from the experiences of particular geographies, whether it's Delhi or Kolkata or Bombay. But Gail actually does a lot of comparative reading of histories, and she references the Progressive Organization of Women, which was formed in Hyderabad in 1980. And you have a film on women and family in the form of a docudrama, which was actually produced along with Stree Shakti Sangatna, which emerged from the Progressive Organization of Women. So, in that sense, the films that I want you to view, these three films at least for this session, which will help you put a face to some of the things that Gail is talking about. So keep that in mind. To come back to the formative, the traditions that shaped Gail's thinking, many of us know that she came to India initially in the 1960s. I suspect just as many young people from the West came looking to India for answers to all kinds of questions. But she went back and returned as a researcher, did her PhD on Mahatma Phule and the Satyashodak movement, went back, submitted her PhD, came back on another research project to try and understand the emergence of women's movements and the women's question in India. So she returned in the 70s to do this thing on women's groups and women's movements. And by that time, Gail was here in the 70s, and she was, let's say, the inheritor to four major or three major traditions of activism and thought. One is, of course, the anti-war movement in the United States, in Europe, and in the UK against the Vietnam War. The second was the civil rights and anti-race politics that had erupted in the United States. But along with that, also the anti-colonial movements which had gathered force in Angola, Mozambique, in a slightly earlier decade in Cuba, and the sorts of very profound anti-colonial sentiments still present in parts of countries which had achieved independence earlier on in Africa. So Gail was also very familiar with those traditions as well. So the anti-race and the civil rights traditions, and of course feminist struggles, as these had emerged in what is now popularly known as the second wave of feminism in Anglo-America. And one important aspect of that second world feminism was also a rethinking of socialism itself. So you had a socialist feminist position emerging in Anglo America, and Gail was familiar with those debates as well. So I think these were the three major sources that fed into her worldview. But it doesn't mean much to say that these shaped her thinking. One needs to also look at things a little more closely. So, if you look at, say, the anti-war traditions that you see, the protest against the Vietnam War, it had a very significant effect in American academia in a very specific kind of way, which was it morphed into a kind of broad anti imperialist academic project, by which I mean that you had a cohort of scholars who came together refusing the Cold War politics of the United States and positioned themselves against the American government's resolute anti communism, whether it was their anti communist attitude with respect to Vietnam or Cuba or China. So there was this group that was formed in the 60s called the Committee of Concerned Asian Scholars, and they decided that in their respective disciplines, whether it was the social sciences or the humanities, they were not going to sort of follow this, what was at that time known as the broad area studies model, where the United States funded research on particular regions with the view of drawing on that research for its Cold War propaganda. And that's how a lot of US research on India was funded as well. Now, this doesn't mean that the researchers were all Cold War enthusiasts or that they all supported American anti communism, but the fact is that the area studies program did have a link with Cold War rhetoric. And the Committee of Concerned Asian Scholars decided that that's not the path they wish to go. They wish to rethink their disciplines. And whether that was possible or not within the university structures, they decided to come together as scholars to generate new ways of thinking about developments in all these countries that the United States saw as its arena for the Cold War. So this included countries in Southeast Asia like Indonesia, Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, Burma, South Asia, which is India, Pakistan. Um, and when they started, there was no Bangladesh, but Bangladesh happened much sooner, much later, and in some parts of Africa. And they brought out a magazine called the Bulletin of Concerned Asian Scholars, which is now called Critical Asian Studies. And Gail contributed a great deal to the debates in that magazine. So she was a sort of India expert, so to speak, though not the only one. There were lots of scholars, Indians and non Indians, writing in that journal. But Gail wrote consistently, and she wrote with an eye on what was happening in India. And therefore, her anti imperialism was not simply what we today associate with reversing the gaze or with speaking back to colonialism, which has been shaped by post colonial debates. But Gail and the scholars who were part of the concerned committee of concerned Asian scholars predated post colonialism in some important ways. They were, if you like, part of what one might call a broad internationalist left, which did not identify with any particular communist party, but which was interested in a kind of a liberal to left perspective on world events. And Gail was very much a part of that. And therefore, when she speaks of anti colonial struggles or when she speaks of fighting imperialism, she's not only looking at discourse, she's not only looking at colonial records, nor is she only sort of looking to see how there were struggles at every subaltern level in the 19th century and later, but she's actually looking at what does it mean to do anti-imperialist politics in the 1960s and 70s, and how would you do that, where would you look to for inspiration. And in her understanding, it doesn't help to sort of mark a kind of a, what we call difference, a politics of difference, that all these colonial societies before colonialism came were very different, and they should draw upon those traditions to fight imperialism. She didn't really feel comfortable with that politics of difference. Rather, she looked to understand colonialism and capitalism as dynamic world systems that transform brutally and cruelly the societies they came into contact with, but also propelled forth important contradictions. And in the Indian context, she understood one of the most important contradictions to emerge as having to do with caste, with the caste question. So, therefore, she did not get caught in this whole thing of valorizing cultural or civilizational difference. On the other hand, she looked at developments in colonial context, both in terms of the horrors of colonial extraction, of capitalist, the limitations of capitalist growth, but also in terms of what did it do to caste society. How did it produce an awareness of caste inequality that was modern and secular? Not that there was no anti caste ideologies in the past, but what did the conditions of colonialism and capitalism create in the Indian context? And for her, that was very important because that was the ground from which she would go on to criticize both caste and gender social arrangements in the Indian context, not from the point of view of valorizing tradition, not from the point of view of looking back to local traditions of thought, not from the point of view of only deconstructing colonial discourses, but from actually tracing a kind of intellectual tradition which holds emancipatory potential. And that emancipatory potential is something that she thinks is important. She thinks Marxism offers one sort of a perspective on it, but these other traditions offer another kind of perspective, and these two have to be brought together and to come together. So, and this becomes extremely important in her writings, especially in the 1980s, but equally so in the early period when she's actually uh, writing from within this anti-imperialist context. And we should remember that, say, for example, the 1975 essay, this occurs in a volume alongside essays on Indonesia, Vietnam, China. So basically, what Gail is doing is providing a way of locating whatever she has found in India within a world historical context. Therefore, the struggle against colonialism in the past and capitalism in the present, is theorized in the context of a bunch of other people also theorizing, whether in Indonesia or Philippines or Vietnam or wherever else in the southeast of Asia, and in Pakistan and later on in Bangladesh. So that's a very important aspect of her work, that she was responding to debates from within this context as well. And that's a very important way in which she also comes to the gender question, because for her, feminism, it's not simply about, as many of us read in our women's studies classes, that there is bourgeois feminism, there's socialist feminism, there is radical feminism. I don't think she would have had any use for those typologies. Neither would she have agreed that there are people's movements, there are class struggles. Feminism is a bourgeois ideal. She wouldn't have agreed with that either. Neither would she have agreed that the struggle against caste inequality is also a struggle for women's rights. She wouldn't have agreed with that either. For her, as she very memorably puts it in the 1975 essay, women are the focus of every contradiction. That's a very important statement, because what she's then telling us is that if there is a contradiction between caste and gender, it is played out in gender terms. So whether it is, say, remember, think of our debates around the women's question around 33% reservation. Sharad Yadav saying that I don't want women with short hair and modern clothes in parliament deciding for other women, and women taking umbrage with that. Now, clearly, Sharad Yadav's anxiety is both masculine, but it also comes from this understanding that if you don't factor in caste, the representatives of women that will make it to parliament are likely to be from elite castes. So I think there is a contradiction there, but equally important is the women's unease with his characterization of women. So women as a focus of every contradiction is something that Gail comes to very early on in her writings. Therefore, she never makes the mistake of imagining that a struggle and those who struggle in that particular context can actually speak for all struggles. So, if it is domestic workers, if it's women fighting unfair property laws, Dalit women fighting for land, tobacco workers fighting for a moderate working day and higher wages, each of these struggles is valid for her, and no one struggle can substitute for the other. So she sees the differences between women. She not only sees the fact that there's patriarchy, which is a system that emerges in a particular historical moment, but that under patriarchy, women also are differently located, and therefore their struggles are going to be differential. And later on, she would say, for dominant caste women, the struggles are with familial patriarchy, whereas for others, it is with public and familial patriarchy. So she didn't sort of speak in the terms that we've got used to, like double burden and triple burden, or we are oppressed thrice, oppressed twice. She was very particular in annotating what she meant. So from the beginning, she had this very clear sense of women being the focus of every contradiction between women and men, between women of one caste and another, between classes. So at every level, gender played a very important role in constituting that contradiction. And that's something that she found a very valuable thing to argue with. And you see why she arrives at that position, because A, she refuses to valorize culture. Women cannot be seen as a repositories of an anti colonial culture. She refuses to valorize social location in itself. And she always thinks of politics as something that you do, and it is in the doing that you arrive at a political identity. So you see that in her early work. So, as far as the anti race discourse of her time is concerned, she draws from it to put forth an anti imperialist argument, and that anti imperialist argument as necessarily has to include an analysis of particular social systems as well as the larger capitalist world system. So you have to have caste and gender as they exist in India in the context of capitalism, just as you have to have an understanding of capitalism as such. So, and I think this movement between the field and the world of ideas. This is something that Gail does all her life, and it's a fantastic back and forth journey that she keeps making. Now, when you come to the whole anti caste, anti race politics that obviously she was familiar with, and the civil rights activism in the United States that she knew, which she references in a number of her writings on reservation well into the 2000s, her articles in the Hindu, for example. She was very aware of that context as well. But what does she make of the whole anti-race politics of her time is that she sees it as a very central aspect of both democratic and socialist revolutions. That it will not do to reduce race to an epiphenomenon. It is not something that can be addressed only at the level of culture or race as such, but that it has a very solid um, um, uh, location within the political economy of the United States. An argument which, of course, African Americans have been making for a long time. W.E. Du Bois made it in his magnum opus, Black Reconstruction. But Gail makes it for her own times as well. And she does this not by directly writing about African American politics, but she draws on the critical scholarship on race to expand her understanding of the caste system. So, thereby, she refuses to accept only ethnographic or anthropological readings of caste or sociological readings of caste. Take, for example, this whole thing about Sanskritization, Srinivas and others, or people like David Mandelbaum and others in anthropology. She takes issue with all of them, including with the redoubtable Louis Dumont. And she talks of how their descriptions freeze the caste order. It does, they assume that there is a system and a logic that is in place and everybody is reacting to that. But instead, she wants us to see human beings as actively constituting and reconstituting this logic. So that's why she says Dalit women in that essay, in the 1975 essay, can work against the logic of the caste order, both in terms of their social and economic location, but also because they have a tradition of cultural understanding, which she links with a broader Bhakti tradition in Maharashtra. And as you know, she was very invested in the Bhakti tradition and in Tukaram's writings and so on, as also in the writings of Raidas. So for her, therefore, the caste order is a dynamic historical order, just as how she sees race not in essentialist terms, but as a historically evolved system interacting with capitalism. Likewise, race is cast as a historically evolved system in the Indian context. And you have to see it in its dynamic aspects, and looking at what Dalit women do with caste helps her understand that dynamism. So that's how she understands the civil rights and the race question. And therefore, she sees anti caste struggles as a very, let's say, inextricable part of the struggle against feudalism, if you like, the struggle for democracy, and the struggle for socialism. It is not something that can be attended to afterwards. In fact, it can even become the precondition for the success of the socialist revolution. That's what she says in her book, Reinventing Revolution. This is something, of course, that the Dalit movement has been saying in different ways. Ambedkar himself was extremely expressive on this subject, but this is how Gail comes to her understanding. And what did she bring from the feminism of her times? Very, very important. She refused to see it in compartmentalized terms. So you have the Betty Friedan kind of feminism, which has to do with the horror of being stuck in in a loveless marriage and in domesticity. That's important for her, but she is very concerned about social reproduction. But she doesn't only see it as a state of mind and what it does to a person, but that it is something that you need to actively transform, and you need social structures in place like compulsory creches, support for childcare, socialization of domestic labor, men taking to domestic tasks, rethinking of marriages, rethinking of the love relationship. And in fact, you will see in your next set of writings how at a feminist gathering in rural Maharashtra, issues of sexuality, including of sexual orientation, were discussed. So, somewhere the sex question for her was not separate from the class and caste questions, and you had to think them together in very complex ways. And you see her doing that in this first decade as well, as will be evident from the writings in your folder. The second thing, of course, is she refuses to except that much of this has happened first in America and elsewhere, and only then in the other parts of the world. In fact, she says the International Year of Feminism, as advocated by the UN, is really part of Cold War politics, and one must instead look for feminism in other traditions of struggle as well. The anti-colonial struggles in Africa, in the kind of communist-led struggles in Cuba, Vietnam, and China, and of course in various struggles in India. So that's how she sees the feminist question, not as something that is a gift from the first world to the third world, something which is very useful to keep in mind considering the advice that everybody is offering the women of Afghanistan today across the world, that we make our own emancipation through our struggles. We can draw from various traditions, but ultimately it's how we come together and how we struggle that achieves this. So that's how she sort of inherits these traditions of thought, but equally from practice, from what she sees on the ground. And one thing is, and there's an essay I've put on methodology in your folder, where she talks of this participatory research. And for her, it doesn't just mean that you sort of pay attention to voices from the field and present them, but also that you actively engage with them in a dialogic sense from where you are, and that you have a political investment in that dialogue. So she actually says in that essay, participatory research has to kind of slowly segue into, sort of lead to a kind of organizational, mobilizational effort to consciousness raising. So the researcher cannot really imagine herself to be someone so totally separate that her investment in what she studies can be restricted to an essay or a paper or a book. Those are very important, but she's also part of what she's studying. She has a political stake in it, and consciousness therefore is important also to what you write. It's not simply what you bring from the field, but what your own consciousness makes of it in conversation with the field. So when she gives us a history of women's activism, you will notice that if you've read other books on the Indian women's movement, she gives you a very different kind of a beginning. So in most histories, you will see people writing about the emergence of Indian feminism from, they will reference an event, maybe the Mathura, the case of Mathura being raped, the Adivasi young woman being raped by two policemen, how that led to a public debate around sexual violence and rape and so on. Or they would point to the importance of dowry related murders in Delhi and how that became a context for women coming out. Or to the kind of political space created by movements like the various Marxist Leninist led agrarian struggles in Bihar, Bengal, Tamil Nadu, Andhra, and in Kerala. So usually it is placed within the context of either a broad left-led struggles or within particular events, or they're traced to particular kinds of movements, whether it's something that happened in Delhi, whether that's something that happened in Bombay City. Now, Gail doesn't do any of that. What she does is she looks at what brought women to the streets from the late 1960s onwards. They may not have had a feminist consciousness as we understand it, but they came to the streets for a number of reasons. The famine in Maharashtra brought them to the streets. The rising prices brought them to the streets in Western India as a whole. In Tamil Nadu, the long drawn out struggle of Dalit agrarian workers against rich peasants brought Dalit women in large numbers to a meeting in the 1970s, even before the CPM had a women's wing. So there were trajectories in different parts of India that brought women to the streets. She gives you an index of what happened in Maharashtra. And she points out that there were different trajectories. There was the famine, there was the anti price rise agitation, there was the mobilizational work done by non traditional left parties like Lal Nishan and the reading circle Magova, which was linked to Lal Nishan. There was the struggle of the Adivasi Beels in Shahada in Western Maharashtra. There was a struggle of the Adivasis in Singhbom, led by the left. There was the Chhattisgarh Mukti Morcha struggle, in which the Chhattisgarh women's group women came together. There was the struggle in Bodh Gaya in Bihar, where the Chhatra Yuva Sangharsh Vahini fought for land rights, including for women. So she indexes a range of struggles across different geographies, and she shows you how each geography presents the women's question in a particular light, and how might you then join the dots. It's not that this is central or that is central, but there are these various moments of eruption across classes. So you might have a domestic workers union, you will also have middle class students protesting. And you will not just have middle class students, but you will have radicalized Dalit students from Nagpur and Aurangabad protesting, women protesting. So you had a number of sites, a number of geographies, and what Gail does for us is she joins the dots. And what helps her joins the dots is that she sees the emergence of a certain consciousness in all these struggles, expressed in a diverse ways, all of which indicate that women want to be acknowledged as producers, as providers, as workers, as wives who will not put up with unhappy marriages, as women conscious of their bodily integrity, who will say no to unwanted sex, who will not sit quiet if they are harassed or if they are sexually assaulted, as young women, as students who want their future to be emancipatory and free, and so on. So she looks at it from multiple angles, and what unites for her all these struggles is the fact that women come to the streets from their locations. It is their coming to their streets, it's the doing of politics that makes them conscious of their condition of inequality. But she also says, again drawing from the Maharashtra experience, if they were only to do that, once the movements are in retreat for some time or for a longer time, then women will experience this sense of loss and tedium. So what has been important is what she calls the interjection of the conscious element. That you have to keep thinking about this, that this pertains to a structure. This is something called patriarchy. You've got to deal with that. And that's where she sees a role for what she calls the conscious element in politics, whether it's a middle class activist working with rural women, or whether it's rural women leaders who are in touch with larger political movements from where they learn the language of politics, whether it is study camps run by left groups in their struggle areas. She sees the importance of conceptually responding to political developments and drawing from concepts just as you draw from practice, and practice and concept constantly being in dialogue. And that can only happen if you have a sense of women also speaking across divides to each other. And for Gail, that's very important. Without valorizing the role of the middle class activist, without saying that this is where it all started, she yet suggests that it's important we see what happens when women come together in conversation. So that essay, Rural Women's Liberation, 1977 essay, which I put into your reading list, she describes the United Women's Conference in Pune in 1977-78, and you see what she means. She actually tells you how different segments came together, and this is also something you will see in Deepa's films, whether it's trade union male organizers and women workers, whether it's middle class activists and women workers, whether it's middle class women learning from each other. There is a sense of a constituency emerging, a feminist constituency characterized by women being in conversation with each other, fighting, arguing, disagreeing, yes. But this is a constituency that emerges from a new phenomenon, the possibility of women learning from each other and their struggles on the ground. So I think for me, Gail's framing of the emergence of Indian women's movements, the value lies in that thing that she captures so effectively, that sense of a comradeship in dialogue and dissension. And I think that is something that she stays with till the 90s. Afterwards, she extends the meaning of dialogue to a broader realm, and we'll come to that, of course, later. But for her, the possibilities of social transformation lie in this culture of dissension and dialogue, which she does not find in any other context in the 70s and 80s, except within the context which are anchored by various women's groups and various women's movements, which is why it's very important to locate Gail's work within a broader feminist problematic. And from there, see where all she travels and where she keeps returning to feminism, where she keeps extending the borders of feminism. And that's what we'll do in the remaining two sessions. I think I've spoken enough for now. I will stop here, and you can either respond to things you've read and seen, or if you have questions on what I've said, those are fine as well. I will leave Rupali to anchor this in whatever way she thinks is the most efficient. Thank you.
So we could unmute, if anybody has a question, we could unmute them and then they can ask their question or give their comments. Okay. I think everybody's thinking after the the trajectory that you have drawn. Hello?
We can also take a short break for 3 minutes or for a few minutes if you think that's all right, or I don't know.
Yes, we could also do that. We could take a break of maybe 3 minutes
Yeah,
and then
sure.
rejoin.
Yeah.
Rupali, do people raise hand or how do they ask their questions? Rupali, this is Professor Dev.
Sir, we can't hear you. Are you saying something?
You can't hear me. I thought my mic is unmuted. No, I was saying how does one ask a question? Does one raise
Oops.
one's hand or something?
Oh, sorry. I only forgot to wear my
Okay, okay.
my apologies.
No, no, no. So
So,
does one raise a hand or what does one do?
yes, one people can raise their hands and then we could unmute them.
Nobody's starting. I had a query. Maybe it's silly, but I just wanted to ask Geeta.
Go ahead, Kushal. You
Uh,
can start.
so when you were saying that Gail was not doing the typical kind of politics of difference, so she was not valorizing traditions, she was not valorizing local cultures or doing a certain kind of anti-colonial this, but she was doing something else. So what she was doing something else at that particular juncture, I missed that idea. So I
You
got the
missed.
later half where you said that that statement that women are the what do you call it the for every contradiction it's the
Yeah, focus of every
focus.
contradiction. Yeah, yeah,
But before that, that how she's different from the typical
yeah, yeah.
that point I somehow missed.
Yeah, no, the thing is, I actually was trying to suggest that there are the way we approached the colonial period, especially in terms of anti-imperialist thought, is one is of course a nationalist approach, which I didn't go into, but in an intellectual sense, there is the whole post-colonial critique of the colonial period, which looks at discourse and ideas and how forms of thought were completely sort of rendered illegitimate by the colonial knowledge system and so on. And implicit in that is a valorization of local traditions, whether it's the subaltern's resistance or whether it is the certain forms of culture that played a role in the nationalist struggle. And this is not simply in India, but elsewhere too. The valorization of pre-colonial cultures has been an aspect of anti-imperialist struggles. What Gail suggests is that one cannot, she just doesn't even enter into the terms of that debate. Instead, what she does is taking that anti-imperialist position in her time in the 1970s, setting herself against the spread of capital under the aegis of the United States. She looks at what is it that would address the contradictions created by capital, and she does not see local cultures in themselves doing that because these are also being acted upon and changed by capital. So, therefore, she maps different kinds of responses that have emerged, and she identifies traditions of struggle and dissent as they are unfolding on the ground as very important, as having emancipatory potential. And then later on, she goes back and gives you a prehistory of those struggles. So, if people are protesting from where they are, Mahar agricultural laborers are protesting, later on she would point to how some of their sense of what they were fighting for may be traced to the anti-caste ideologies which they have inherited. So she doesn't valorize difference. Instead, she locates difference in terms of how it is acted upon by modern forces of capital and other developments and so on. Even with the Adivasis, she says that. It's a very interesting debate that she points to in one of the essays, where in the 1970s, in the Ho Adivasis don't have women don't have access to land, and there is also a custom where if they are assaulted by non-Adivasi men, they are not allowed entry into the community after that. And of course, then what sort of how do you then think about customary law with respect to the Adivasis? So I think when she looks at such examples, she sees the value of a certain type of secular normative reasoning, which in particular circumstances could be anything else. In the case of the Adivasis, there was a suggestion that the Hindu code bill should apply to them. This is what the Satyashoda Communist Party advocated. But the Beals themselves did not want that. They felt that they will hold on to their traditions wherever they are progressive and see if they can sort of mount a resistance to patriarchy in other ways. So she worked with difference in very complex ways. So two students have put their hands up.
Okay, no. So for me, it was so how is she putting up a counter kind of argument against? certain kind of theorization.
She's not putting a counter argument, but you can read her in that context. She's not really addressing those arguments. I am placing her in the context of post colonial debates.
Um, Professor Deb, could you please unmute Bhakti first?
I have to do it, is it? Then what did I do in terms of giving you ownership? Nothing has happened.
Hello.
Yeah,
No.
Can you hear me?
yeah, I
Yeah,
can.
Bhakti can do it. Yeah.
Oh, um, thank you, ma'am, for this insightful lecture. This is my first exposure to Gail Omwin's writing, and I couldn't have asked for more. So thank you very much for this. I read all the texts that you had prescribed, and I have a question on one of the texts on the patriarchy, which I found very dense. The way she engages with different theoretical traditions of patriarchy, and uh, honestly, not a very easy read for me. uh, I understood that she understood patriarchy, and as you also pointed out in your lecture, that as a system on its own, which had two pillars: production of life and production of uh, things, and they are not they are separate, but they are also interlinked, as she says in that essay. What I had difficulty in understanding is, in terms of historicity, does she locate patriarchy as something concurrent with class system or class society? At the beginning of the class society, the patriarchy also emerges, or does she locate it as a pre-class structure? So I didn't really understand that part very well. Thank you.
So she does, and you, when you read your readings for next week, this gets a little clearer. At this stage, she's basically reviewing all these theories, as you said, of patriarchy and trying to make sense of, how does one treat this term. And she sees it in terms of the emergence of class society, but with this caveat that class society does not emerge only with capital. Class society emerges in other contexts as well, and one has to theorize class differences in those terms. An argument she will come back to in her work on rural agrarian realities, theorizing of rural India, which we will be reading for next week's class. So that is one thing. And the second thing is that she locates patriarchy as a form of political power. So it is not simply gender roles, what we call male chauvinist attitudes, or male authority within the family, which constitute patriarchy. It's not only those, but it also emerges at a certain moment in history when you have very firm class divisions in place, and the state is a class state. The state it endorses class divisions in a certain way. So basically, she wants us to see patriarchy as a political system as well. While in feminist theorizing, it is understood implicitly to be a political system, often the reference to patriarchy remain defined by marriage, inheritance, family, and kinship. Uh, In a historical sense, patriarchy is then related to law, sometimes to state policies on the other, and so on. But what Gail wants us to notice is that patriarchy has to be seen coeval with the emergence of class and state. And now that's an argument that you can take on board, refuse, disagree with, and so on. But I think she's saying something very important about lifting it out of what is seen as narrowly women's concerns. It's not that she agrees that these are women's concerns, but she's basically saying that you have to see it also as a political phenomenon. And connected to this is the argument in the same essay that you can't see production and reproduction, production of life and production of goods, as separate like that. It's not that women make babies and put out workers in the world. The fact that women make babies also implicitly produces a certain kind of economic system. So women making babies under feudalism has one meaning. Women making babies under capitalism has another meaning. So the production system is acted upon by social reproduction also, just like how production shapes social reproduction. They are mutually constitutive. You cannot see one as being subsumed in the other. So if you accept that, then you see why patriarchy has to be on the same level as class and state. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
I'm sorry, Professor Dev. I think you have to accept others as well. Uh, Professor Dev?
Yeah, Adesh is unmuted.
Yeah.
I think he can do it himself. Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah. Carry on.
Really, thank you for this very insightful presentation. I have few points.
Adesh, your voice is falling. Can you speak into the mic?
Yeah. Now I'm clear.
Yeah, yeah.
Am I clear now?
Yes, yes, yes.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I was just saying ki, a really insightful presentation. I have few points through which I will try to locate my question, which I'm trying to seek. Uh, in the what you presented in your presentation, I think that's a very brilliant reading which Gail presented. Like we always have been taught, and generally we see a linear reading of history of Indian feminism, and Gail's refusal of that kind of reading, and she's trying to locate it from the multiple angles, and how the overall consciousness raising process happening, and the communication which different groups of women are doing, and in that way she is looking from a totality how this consciousness making process is happening, not just. And another point which I want to say, you also pointed that how she is understanding the dynamic character of caste order. In that way, the this dynamicity is contributing, is giving a space where subjective anti-caste and anti-caste agency can contribute in the overall struggle of anti-caste movement. And she is also locating she is also reading the histories of anti-caste tradition and trying to extrapolate the possibility of a possibility of Indian feminist account. So these all 3 points, how she, I mean, in the first point, she's typically in deploying the Marxist framework, how consciousness should be understood and not just in a linear pattern. Still, this reading of extrapolating different account of anti-caste literature, how she is different from the Marxist framework, and what actually Gail is trying to seek in terms of extrapolating anti-caste politics.
Yeah. So that's a very good question. The one to understand exactly what she was trying to do, one must locate her work in the context of, uh, and which we'll of course look at in some detail in the second workshop. But basically, you have the notion of the social totality. Marxists are very concerned about theorizing the social totality. So in the 1960s and after, the idea of theorizing social totality has become somewhat more diverse, given the world historical conditions. A, revolution in Cuba, developments in China, both of which have expanded our understanding of how you might think of the revolutionary moment itself, and of the importance of waging a rural revolutionary struggle. This is what Mao Zedong had brought into world politics, and this is the politics that shaped the activities of the Committee of Concerned Asian Scholars, who are trying to understand things from a progressive liberal left perspective. So they all came to the question of social totality very differently from an earlier generation of leftists. So it was not simply the older Soviet model of base and superstructure, or of a kind of a unfolding of various stages of historical growth, the so-called modes of production debate, you know, and one mode of production giving way to another mode of production. Gail, in fact, will tell you in one of her essays in the 80s how this has dominated Indian Marxist theorizing on many aspects. So, for her, what is important is how do you intervene in these debates in a manner that is productive, that also pays attention to what people are actually doing, what the working class is actually doing, whether in the cities or whether in agrarian India or whether in the tribal belt. So you have three realities in the Indian context. So looking at all those struggles, she enters this debate about the social totality, and she immediately it makes it very clear that you cannot have this base superstructure model, because caste is neither base nor superstructure. Caste is both simultaneously. It is a relationship of production. It is also a social relationship. So that is something that she constantly keeps bringing up in her dialogue and debate and in her polemics with the Indian Marxist conceptual traditions. So that's something that she considers very important. Then how do you conceptualize caste? If caste is both a production relationship as well as something that shapes social identity, not simply social relations of production, but identity itself, denoting status, denoting touchability, untouchability, and so on. How do you then theorize caste? And here she looks to the anti caste traditions from the time of the Buddha onwards, because she sees that caste has been challenged through history. She sees the history of anti caste movements as unfolding over a period of time. And what precisely have they challenged? Have they challenged relations of production? Have they challenged social identities? Have they proposed a model of fraternity cutting across various kinds of working lives? What is their understanding of work as such? So I think she looks to the anti caste traditions to pick out elements that will feed into her understanding of social totality. And in her own time, you had a rethinking of anti caste politics from many quarters. You had the Dalit Panthers who had emerged in the early 1970s, who were thinking of Marxism in very different ways. You had Sharad Patil, who had come out of the CPM and he had formed the Satyashoda Communist Party, the very definite commitment to tracing an anti caste intellectual and historical lineage. You also had various Naxalite groups across Bihar and Bengal and in Andhra Pradesh, where the caste question could not be put away in straightforward terms. So because you had caste and gender and class coming together in very complex ways. And Gail is very aware of those kinds of debates also. So she draws from all of these things, and she proposes a model of looking at social totality, bringing in the anti-caste perspective, but which she sees coming alive in the practices of working women, whether it is the agrarian struggles or the urban struggles or the Adivasi struggles. So it is women's experience of these contradictions that helps her in practical terms understand all the issues at stake.
Tejendra, I think.
Tejendra, could you please unmute yourself? I think. Okay.
Yeah, hello. Good evening, ma'am. Thank you for a very illustrative presentation. I had one question. So, how does see the hidden marginalities in context of Adivasi women as well as scheduled caste women complement with each other or challenge? And the second question is, how do you see when they interact in the same in context of labor, so then how we can theorize such basically a social pathology which emerged in due course of capitalist regime, basically. Thank you.
So, in the kinds of geographies that Gail references in her work, they are very particular geographies. So when she's looking at, say, the struggle of Adivasi Bhil women, this is the Bhil community as a whole, which is in debt bondage to rich peasants and landlords in a particular part of Maharashtra. So that is not a caste order so much as you have caste society impinging on a tribal existence within an overall political economy where capital has opened up certain avenues for the rich peasants and the landlords. So this is a broad picture within which she understands the role of Adivasi women in struggle. So in that particular context, she looks at the work of the Shramik Sangatna, which was very active in that part of Maharashtra in the 1970s. And she looks at the kinds of issues that they picked up as pertinent and how did that sort of emerge from what the Adivasis were themselves doing in terms of mobilizing and acting. The whole struggle by a local Adivasi Gandhian leader called Amber Singh, and how that sort of mobilized Adivasis into protesting landlord atrocities, and how the coming of a radical left group to that part of Maharashtra then sort of open up the world of politics in some interesting ways, and how did women inhabit those political spaces, and women come to those political spaces from different locations as women who are sexually vulnerable to the violence upper caste or dominant caste landlords and their henchmen, women who also find that they are blocked from access to community resources, whether it is land or other forms of assets, women who also face domestic violence at home who have to deal with alcoholism, and who make it clear that they are not doing this because they have a puritanical attitude to drink, but because they wish to sort of uphold the dignity of their own domestic spaces. So when you talk about hidden marginalities, the women here are not really hidden so much as they're very much in the forefront fighting, just like the Adivasi women in Singbom, or the mine workers, women mine workers in Chhattisgarh. So as workers, they are very visible and they are fighting out for rights as workers. But as women who face a particular kind of gender sexual oppression within the families, they are not so visible, and it's only the presence of a feminist understanding, whether that comes from organizers from outside or from local village leaders who have picked up, who have sort of come to the language of feminism both from experience and from listening to other women. The marginality which appears hidden is actually very central to the feminism that Gail is talking about. And likewise with Dalit women, that the book We Shall Smash This Prison starts with her acquaintance with Mahar agricultural laborers in Maharashtra. And what does their worldview have to tell us about gender politics? So for her, these are not marginal women. They are central to the struggle against patriarchy. They constitute the biggest element of the fight against patriarchy. And she, in fact, says that conscious middle class feminists from the cities, while they are in touch with these rural realities, they simply lack the organizational and mobilizational resources to work with these women beyond a point. So they can sort of, at the level of ideas and consciousness, interact with them. But at the level of organizing and mobilizing, you need powerful local organizations. So, in however you understand how women are protesting dispossession when it comes to, say, development projects that take away their land, or women are protesting rent extraction, which comes to the forefront when you have rent extraction by landlords who are seeking to enhance their own petty commodity capitalism. Whatever form capital impinges on their lives, they are ready to struggle and fight. But in a feminist sense, we have no feminist organizational presence in these areas. Organizational support can only be provided by local people's movement. And there, to remain feminist is a struggle for these local women. So, in that sense, perhaps one can talk of marginalities. But as for the women themselves, in Gail's understanding, they are not marginal.
Um, Thank you, Dr. Geeta. I also have a question.
Sure.
So we do see snippets of Gail's own position in her work, right? When she talks about methodology, even I read an introduction to the book you had suggested. And she so like how do we see her ideas, because she was of course an American sociologist who lived in Maharashtra, who worked for marginalized communities in Maharashtra, but how do we see her ideas as, I mean, through the I mean, in interaction with feminist epistemology or standpoint theory or insider outsider binary, which even me as a researcher, as a Dalit researcher, do face, you know, this kind of dilemmas or this kind of questions by in the field as well as in a university setup. So how did Omvid locate her way through these epistemology or theories that existed?
Right. Yeah, that's a very important question, and something I don't think we can have very definite answers on. But one thing is that what I understand by from Gail's own account of her work in the field and her the way she looks at knowledge production itself, she's willing to take that risk, that she is interested in this area of work. She has a strong feminist socialist sensibility. Finds that in the Indian context, the anti-caste traditions are a very important and valuable source of political and social knowledge. And bringing them together and doing that sort of research and writing that she does, she is willing to undertake that risk of speaking about certain realities which she thinks are important to be spoken about. So, from the view of how does she see her own work, does she see it as representative of anything? I don't think so. I think what she's alerting us to is to the fact that we all write at a certain moment in time. We write at a certain moment in history. We are active in certain places at certain times. And how do you inhabit those spaces and times? And I think that's very important. And Gail inhabits them with civility, with respect, listening to dissent, disagreeing, and she disagrees with both sides. It's not that her identification with the oppressed makes her accept everything they say either, but she's also found a way of um, disagreement which keeps avenues of dialogue open. And this you will see throughout, whether it is with the farmers movement with whom she disagrees, whether it was the Dalit Panthers whom she admires a great deal but she finds them not particularly sensitive to gender, or whether it's the ecological movement for which she has great empathy but she thinks they are caste blind. So I think there are ways in which she negotiates these terms of disagreement with civility, understanding, and scholarship. And ultimately, I think she risks a epistemological and moral wager. For her, politics is fundamentally ethical, and she never lets us forget that. Not so much in saying it in so many words, but if you follow the train of her thought, it is very clear that whatever she's saying ultimately is important because we all have this ethical commitment to justice and equality. It is not simply a philosophical or a political commitment to justice, it must be an ethical commitment to justice. And that is where she also is very uneasy with, let's say, standardized Marxist formulations. She wants to recover the ethical core in Marxism also. So finally, when she comes to writing Seeking Begumpura, which is at a latter point in her life, what does she want us to notice about Raidas or Periyar or Ayotitas or Phule or Tukaram or anybody else? I mean, her last work was on Tukaram. She translated Tukaram's writings. Basically, she refuses to separate the ethical, the philosophical, and the political. And this is something, of course, anybody in the Ambedkarite tradition is very familiar with. Ambedkar also refused to separate the three. For him, prajna without shield was useless. You cannot have wisdom without shield. So I think that there is that thing that she picks up from the anti-caste traditions, but perhaps it's also a kind of a politics that she brings to whatever she sees. It goes both ways. So for her, things like standpoint might not have really meant much, because she's risking that wager, and she's inviting all of us to risk that wager. And we must and when she talks to a feminist, say in the cities, in Pune or Bombay or wherever, and after all she was part of the first three conferences of women's movements. Till Patna she was a very active participant. She didn't come to Calicut, but she engaged with the women's movement throughout in different ways. And you will see that as and I will be bringing that up in the next two workshops. And I think one of the most important ways of engagement was for her was to constantly push feminists to extend their own understanding and to say that for your feminism to be complete in the Indian context, you have to engage with these anti-caste traditions. Just as you would tell Sharad Patel, you have to engage with contemporary feminism. You know, so I think she does that in different ways, in both epistemologically. So if you take a book like Reinventing Revolution or even Dalits and the Democratic Revolution, you will see how she places various movements in conversation with each other. So you'll have the farmers movement, you'll have the ecological movement, you have the women's movement, and she's telling you, look, they were all happening at the same time and they all had shared concerns. In some places they spoke, some places they fought. So for us as students, as scholars, if we want to carry something from her work into our own practice in the classroom or outside, this emphasis on sort of, you extend and you learn and you push yourself and you come back, that constant movement, I think, is what she's invested in. So I think, I mean, I don't know. I mean, if people read her differently, I'm willing to, I'd be happy to listen to that. I see her as perhaps not quite invested in politics that looks at standpoint or an epistemology that can be read off locations. For her, thought is work. You have to think. It's a labor, and to labor at things, most of us can labor, but that labor must have ethical intent.
I mean, just to um, put it there. I was because I did get such kind of questions of being insider outsider or being more of an activist than a scholar. as a Dalit scholar in a university setup. So I mean, I think her work, Omvid's work, make a lot of sense when we read about native ethnography as such. That the importance of native ethnography, because otherwise, native ethnography is not seen so crucial. Not bringing much to the debate, or not. I mean, it is generally criticized that it is very limiting. But I think Omvid moves beyond that, and she actually pushes that forward. That okay, native ethnography is also important, although she herself might not be native in one sense. But I think that is what her work. That is why her work becomes very crucial, and she
Yes.
also talks about how an alliance or how an ally would be. I think she fills that role really well.
Yeah, see, look at her sources, for example. How many people she quotes locally? For example, when she talks about the more freeing cultures of Dalits and Bahujan households, she is not making an ideological point. She's giving you some very interesting information also as to how to process that. So she's looking at all these diverse notices placed in papers. That's an interesting source. Even methodologically, while she may not be, as you say, a native ethnographer, she brings to the fore a certain kind of native source that we have seldom seen before her writing in social sciences. You may have you may have informants in the field, but to actually draw from traditions of thought which have not found their way into scholarship, and you can just go to any of these magazines that have been around for some time, like EPW. Just do a content search. You will see that words like caste is of course always there. It's spoken of in different ways, but you will see that the politically loaded terms like anti-caste movements or political movements don't make it to these pages, those terms, until much after the 70s and 80s. And Gail was one of the first to actually draw on these sources and make a case for political, historical understanding of struggles, which nobody had paid any attention to until then, and drawing from those sources. She uses Jnanodaya, she uses so many things that really belong to, what you might call the anti-caste counterpublics, but which have seldom, today it might seem commonsensical. It was not in her time, not at all.
I agree with that, and thank you for for addressing my question. Thus, I think we have 3 more minutes before we give space again. Professor Vigita gives an analysis of the. I think I don't know analysis, but takeaway from today's class. Anybody has any questions or okay, Professor Vigita, please go ahead. Oh, sorry. Okay, Tejendra. Tejendra, please unmute yourself.
Yeah, thank you. I will not leave any chance to question. So yeah, so ma'am, you were saying about you're denying the fact that about the marginalities. I meant actually the hidden marginalities means for me the daily struggle which come across in a periphery, as Rupali mentioned that in the setting of geographical area where in the periphery of women like scheduled caste women lives, and in Adivasi lives in the center, and the most of the institution structure is still dominated by the upper caste people, then both of side. And then what happened in the cross sections, uh, one side upper caste means uh, basically social uh, relations happens in a caste basis, but at the same time in the Adivasi you will see there is a class. So the cross section happens within, in the class difference and in the caste. It's a very rampant, and it's very hard to even though articulate. And what I have seen in my experience. So how do you see those? Uh, you know, Either these are inherent within the ideological setup of society, or either it's something which always we see but we are not able to articulate. So how do you see these things can be captured while interacting or maybe working with them?
Yeah, I think I would like to stay with Gail Omid's own understanding of these issues. rather than what I might think of any of them, because I think she has so much to teach us. So, one of the things that I find useful about her work is that you have the dominant caste on one hand, then you have marginalities. Um, Dalits constitute one kind of a marginality, the Adivasis constitute another. Then there is also a class difference between, say, uh, uh, sections of the dominant classes, caste. There is also a class difference between Adivasis and Dalits, if I understand you right, right, Tejendra?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
That's
Rightly
what you're
said.
saying, right? That's what you're saying. Now, that is, of course, something that we see in different parts of India in different ways. It doesn't, there is no one manner in which this unfolds, these differences, right? So, Gail pays attention to this whole question of relationship between caste and class, say, in the course of a peasant struggle. She, so for instance, you have a struggle for remunerative prices. Farmers are asking better prices for their goods. And we see that kind of a struggle even today that's in progress in our own time. Farmers holding on to their understanding of a fair and just price for their product, for what they grow, better terms of exchange for them, and so on. That's what we are seeing today in today's India also. So in that sense, she's also faced with the question, but is it, can one talk of the agrarian economy as a whole? The agrarian economy is also divided into castes and classes. So within the farmers, you have those that have access to a large amount of land, those that have access to very, very modest amounts of land, and those with no land. While those with no land are mostly Dalits, in that sense, you have caste and class coming together. You also have, say, Maratha Kunbis in Maharashtra, for example, some of whom have very little land. So, how do you understand this? If you are talking about inequalities, there are several levels of inequalities, and Gail touches on all of these things. So, she would say, in any given situation, you're only talking about these things in a practical, everyday sense. So, while we are very aware of these internal contradictions, we are also very aware the agrarian economy as a whole is being diddled out by others. So therefore, at that level of argument, you need to speak of the agrarian economy. But when it comes to differences within the agrarian economy, without hesitation, Gail would make a case for what is owed to the Dalit agricultural laborers. And within that whole economy, she will also forefront the needs and demands of women, especially women who have no stake in the family system, like single women, abandoned women, divorced women, and so on. So she was very sensitive to these multiple iniquities. Now, the relationship between, in her own work, between Adivasis and Dalits, I don't think she had a chance to work at that kind of encounter, because she was not witness to that, the areas that she was familiar with. But I'm sure there too she would apply such a nuanced and particular kind of analysis.
Um, Thank you, Dr. Vigita. We have around 8 minutes. I mean, if you would like to wrap up
Yeah,
today's class, it would be
yeah,
great.
yeah. A very short wrap up, since it's been a long session for most of you. So this is the first, of course, of the three workshops that we are all part of, to understand and learn from Gail's thinking about feminism. And what I attempted to do in this first workshop was to indicate the nature of Gail's thought world, as I call it, and how she was very important, how she considered concept making and building ideas as a very important part of the work that she undertook, and how she drew from both traditions of thought as well as practical political organizing on the ground, and then how she moved very deftly between these two realms of practice and thought, and how whatever influences fed into her work, they are of a global nature. She yet anchored each of these influences within the field that she was studying, that field that she was trying to understand. And from there, she would then move on to abstract and contribute to the larger theoretical argument, as well as we see in her understanding of patriarchy. And for Gail, feminism was a very important uh, uh, f- um, uh, anchoring moment of both her thought as well as her politics, because it was in what she was witness to in the 70s, in the making of what I've called a feminist constituency, which is that women across caste, class, geographical divides have all taken to the streets. They are all angry. They're all asking questions about inequality. And they're also in conversation with each other. And she points to how this unfolded in Maharashtra. And it is in the possibilities that such conversations hold out, where you have people struggling on the ground and where you have what she calls an interjection of consciousness from those who are not of that same struggle but who understand that struggle and who are from the outside. And it is in that coming together of many different experiences of inequality and conversations about inequality that the possibility of a broad socialist democratic politics for her exists. And it is from this constituency of women from diverse locations within a specific geography that she then presents us with a theoretical and conceptual way of thinking about society. And that takes her into questioning assumptions about land, labor, capital, and so on. So for me, fundamentally, her thought world rests on her discovery of a particular history and a particular practice in Maharashtra, which she then builds into a larger argument about feminism and patriarchy. And from that context, she looks at social totality as a whole. That's what I've tried to take you through. And as I said, uh, one way of sort of understanding the immense radical nature of her enterprise is to read her and watch those films, because you see those women that she speaks of in the flesh in those films. It is from those contexts that she draws inspiration. And that's a very useful way to think about her work, as also the other films, because as we go along you'll see how I've tried to match other films with her writings. And for the next workshop, I've already put up a couple of questions, and I'd be happy if some of you, either as a group or individually, prepare, say, a 5 to 10 minute response to some of those questions. And I leave it to you to coordinate with Rupali to do that. And so, see you all next week. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Dr. Geeta, and everyone. Yeah. Professor Dev, would you like to say something?
No, it's okay.
Okay.
So I just request everybody to read and come and see the documents.
All right. See you all next week.
Yeah,
Bye
thanks so
bye.
much.